After creating one of the biggest comedy podcasts on the planet, making tens of millions of dollars, raising 2 children, and spending 18 years together, comedians Tom Segura and Christina Pazsitzky are officially divorced. If this were any other celebrity couple, the news might not be that surprising. But Tom and Christina were different. For years, fans believed they had figured out something most couples couldn't. They weren't just husband and wife. They seemed like best friends who could talk about almost anything, laugh about the most uncomfortable subjects, and still remain completely connected. That was what made Your Mom's House so popular. Tom and Christina openly discussed their marriage, their personal lives, their embarrassing moments, and even subjects most couples would never bring up publicly. Their willingness to joke about everything made their relationship seem almost unbreakable. But after the divorce announcement, some of those old jokes started to sound very different. What once looked like harmless comedy began to look like possible warning signs. And this wasn't happening in isolation. For years, fans had already noticed that Tom himself seemed to be changing. The comedian they once saw as relatable and down-to-earth was becoming increasingly wealthy, image-conscious, and disconnected from the audience that had helped build his career. While fans were busy debating the new Tom Segura, they may have missed something much more important. They were watching his marriage slowly fall apart in public. And to understand how that happened, we have to go back to the beginning, before the mansion, the luxury cars, the private jets, and the millions of dollars. Back when Tom and Christina were simply 2 comedians building a podcast together. When Tom Segura and Christina Pazsitzky started Your Mom's House around 2010, podcasting was nothing like the massive industry it is today. They got the idea from Joe Rogan, and Rogan's producer, Brian Redban, helped them officially launch the show. At the beginning, there was nothing glamorous about it. It was essentially 2 comedians sitting together, talking about their lives, reacting to strange things they found online, and saying things most couples would never say publicly. That openness became the heart of the podcast. Tom and Christina talked about their past relationships, embarrassing moments, intimacy, family, and almost every uncomfortable subject they could turn into a joke. And the more they shared, the more connected their audience became. Listeners didn't just feel like they were watching 2 comedians. They felt like they knew Tom and Christina personally. That connection became even stronger as the podcast developed its own strange universe of inside jokes, recurring characters, and phrases that only longtime fans understood. Words like mommy, jeans, and high and tight became part of the show's identity. The couple also introduced their audience to bizarre internet personalities who became recurring characters in the Your Mom's House world. For longtime listeners, the podcast wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a community. And that community mattered because, despite their growing success, Tom and Christina still appeared relatable. They were successful comedians, but they didn't seem completely removed from ordinary life. They were 2 people building something together. 2 comedians. 2 parents. And, most importantly, 2 best friends who happened to be married. At the time, almost nobody could have imagined how dramatically that dynamic would eventually change. Tom's career began changing rapidly in 2014 when he released his Netflix special Completely Normal. At the time, Netflix was becoming a major force in comedy, and Tom was getting in early. He followed that special with Mostly Stories in 2016 and Disgraceful in 2018. As Tom's name grew, more people discovered Your Mom's House and became fans of the couple. Between 2016 and 2019, the podcast entered what many fans remember as the Fat Tom era. Tom was successful, but he still looked like an ordinary guy. He dressed casually, spoke without much of a filter, and constantly joked around with Christina. That combination made him incredibly relatable. But success was beginning to change the balance between them. Tom was becoming the bigger star. He was taking on larger tours, releasing more comedy specials, and building an audience that followed him independently of the podcast. Christina was also building her own career. She toured around the country and released her own Netflix special in 2017. But then she became pregnant with their first child, and later their second in 2018. Her career naturally slowed down while Tom's continued accelerating. In 2019, Tom's Take It Down tour reportedly grossed around $4.3 million. By 2020, the couple had moved into a $6.6 million mansion. The lifestyle that once seemed completely out of reach was now their reality. Sports cars, luxury watches, more money, more fame, and eventually, a very different Tom Segura. The success was earned through years of hard work. But ironically, that same success would become one of the biggest forces pulling Tom and Christina apart. Tom's success didn't just change his career. It changed the way he lived. He had originally started taking his health more seriously after the birth of his first son in 2015. But over time, fitness became a major part of his identity. He lost around 50 pounds, worked out consistently, traveled with a personal trainer, and followed a strict high-protein diet. There was nothing wrong with getting healthier. But the physical transformation came alongside something much bigger. The old fat Tom had seemed ordinary, relatable, and comfortable with being an average guy. The new Tom looked increasingly like someone living in an entirely different world. Designer clothes, luxury watches, expensive sports cars, even private jets. And Tom wasn't shy about showing that lifestyle to his audience. He began referring to his fans as pores. At first, it seemed like another exaggerated joke. Tom was openly acknowledging that he had become rich and was playing up the image of an arrogant celebrity. But over time, some fans stopped seeing it as just a joke. The word poor became a recurring part of the podcast, and Tom increasingly seemed comfortable mocking the financial struggles of ordinary people. That became even more controversial when he publicly criticized an American Airlines employee after being forced to gate-check his bag. Tom described the employee as someone using the little power she had in her life. When fans pushed back, he didn't apologize. Instead, he argued that people should simply deal with their own financial problems and shouldn't expect him to hide his success because it made them uncomfortable. For longtime fans, this was different. They had always understood Tom's insults as comedy. But now they were beginning to wonder. Where did the joke end, and the real Tom begin? And that question would become even more complicated when Andrew Tate entered the picture. At first, Andrew Tate was just another strange internet personality on Your Mom's House. When Tate's clips appeared on the podcast, Tom and Christina treated him like one of the show's usual cool guys. Christina was particularly skeptical. She joked about liking Tate while also describing him as a narcissistic person who seemed bitter about relationships. Tom initially agreed that Tate's views were extreme. But something changed when Tom eventually met Tate in person. By then, Tom's own life had changed dramatically. In March 2020, Tom released his fourth Netflix special, Ball Hog, just as the pandemic shut down much of the comedy industry. With clubs and theaters closed, podcasts and streaming specials became more important than ever. Tom took advantage of that moment. Your Mom's House expanded into an entire media company, with shows like Two Bears One Cave featuring Bert Kreischer and Where My Mom's At featuring Christina. The couple now operated a professional studio in Austin, Texas, with dozens of employees. The simple podcast they once recorded at home had become a serious business. And when Andrew Tate eventually appeared as a guest, the conversation felt different from the earlier jokes about him. Tate openly promoted a highly submissive view of relationships, telling Christina that women should do more to keep their husbands happy. Christina played along for the audience, but she also questioned his ideas. Tom, however, appeared increasingly interested in what Tate was saying. At the time, fans could still dismiss it as comedy. But looking back, the interview became another moment people connected to Tom's transformation. Because by then, the change wasn't just about money or appearance. Tom's entire public persona seemed different. And soon, fans would start noticing the same changes inside his marriage. For years, Tom and Christina had joked about divorce, other relationships, and even what their lives might look like if they ever separated. At the time, fans had little reason to take those jokes seriously. That was simply how the couple communicated. But as Tom's public personality became more aggressive and distant, some of those jokes began to feel different. Tom frequently joked about other women and even talked about what his second wife might be like. Christina usually played along, but there were moments when her reaction suggested the jokes weren't always completely harmless. In one conversation, Tom even joked about wanting children with a future girlfriend, despite having already had a vasectomy. Christina responded by making it clear that she wanted their children to remain special to him. Again, any one of these moments could simply be comedy. But there were other moments that sounded much more personal. Christina once talked about how Tom rarely complimented her and wasn't particularly affectionate with her. Then there was the issue of Tom's touring schedule. By this point, Tom was constantly working. Tours, television projects, podcasts, and the growing YMH business consumed more and more of his time. In a 2022 conversation, comedian Al Franken even described the amount of touring as being almost abusive to the family. Christina agreed. She admitted that Tom's schedule was a serious problem. Tom himself later acknowledged that he had taken on too much, saying that his workload had become exhausting and taxing on both him and his family. But despite recognizing the problem, the pattern continued. Even their 15th wedding anniversary became an uncomfortable moment. When Christina brought up celebrating the occasion, Tom casually responded that he was busy and didn't even seem particularly interested in making plans. It was a small moment. But an 18-year marriage rarely collapses because of one massive argument. Sometimes, it's the small things that slowly build up over years. And by this point, fans were beginning to wonder if Tom and Christina were no longer experiencing their marriage the same way. Then came the moments that made fans look back at the marriage differently. Christina's relationship with Tom had always included jokes about affection, attraction, and even divorce. But after everything that had happened, some of those jokes no longer felt quite as harmless. The change became especially noticeable when Christina faced the biggest health crisis of her life. In 2024, she revealed that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Fans immediately rallied around her. When the subject eventually came up on the podcast, both Tom and Christina continued to joke about it, just as they had always done. But some of Tom's jokes sounded unusually cold. He joked about having to pretend to be sad if Christina died and suggested that he would simply move on. Again, their entire relationship had been built around dark humor. So it's impossible to know exactly how seriously either of them took those comments. But there were other moments that made fans question what was really happening behind the jokes. Christina once expressed that she wanted more affection from Tom. And then came one particularly revealing moment. Christina told Tom that she loved him. Instead of responding emotionally, Tom became distracted talking about a croissant he hadn't eaten in a long time. To some viewers, it was just another ridiculous YMH moment. To others, it looked like something much sadder. Christina appeared to be reaching for an emotional connection while Tom seemed completely distracted. And that's what made the old clips so difficult to interpret after the divorce. Maybe they were still jokes. Maybe there were problems fans never saw. Or maybe the marriage had been struggling for years while the audience only saw carefully selected moments through a camera. The truth is, nobody watching the podcast could truly know what happened behind closed doors. But by 2026, the speculation was about to become reality. By July 2026, the rumors became reality. TMZ reported that Tom Segura and Christina Pazsitzky were getting divorced after 18 years of marriage. According to the initial reports, the separation had actually happened months earlier. The split was described as amicable, and the two planned to continue co-parenting their children and working together on Your Mom's House. Christina later addressed the situation publicly. And instead of attacking Tom, she did something very different. She thanked the fans who had supported them throughout the years. She explained that the decision had been extremely difficult, but that they had tried to make the relationship work for several years, for themselves, their children, and their family. Eventually, they simply couldn't make it work. Christina also reminded the audience that their lives had been intertwined for almost 2 decades. Their fans had watched them get married. They had watched them struggle as young comedians. They had watched them have children. They had watched them experience tragedy, illness, and everything in between. And now, after all those years, they were watching the end of the marriage. But Christina made one thing clear. They were still going to prioritize their children. And despite the divorce, she wasn't presenting Tom as an enemy. She was simply acknowledging that their relationship as husband and wife had come to an end. Then Tom addressed the audience himself. And his response was noticeably different. When Tom finally addressed the divorce, his tone was very different from Christina's. He made it clear that he didn't believe he owed the audience a detailed explanation. Tom explained that they had actually been recording separate episodes for quite some time because the separation wasn't something they had suddenly decided on. It had already been a long and painful process. He described divorce as an emotional roller coaster, saying that your feelings can change many times in a single day. But Tom also made one thing very clear. He wasn't going to keep talking about it publicly. He said he wouldn't be doing interviews, podcasts, or press appearances to explain the details of the breakup. As far as Tom was concerned, this was his statement. He wanted to focus on his children, Christina, and moving forward. And that difference between Tom and Christina became part of the story itself. Christina spoke emotionally about everything they had experienced together. Tom was more guarded and frustrated by the public reaction. Interestingly, Christina's episode received more than twice the views of Tom's episode. And online, many fans appeared to side with Christina. But there's an important detail that often gets lost in the discussion. None of us actually know everything that happened inside their marriage. We saw the podcast. We saw the jokes. We saw the arguments and affectionate moments that made it onto the show. But we never saw their entire private life. So blaming one person with absolute certainty would be impossible. What we can say is that the audience watched these two people change over nearly 2 decades. And eventually, the relationship that once made millions of people believe in their friendship and marriage came to an end. That's what makes the story so sad. Fans aren't simply mourning the divorce of two celebrities. They're mourning the version of Tom and Christina that they spent years believing in. The two broke comedians who built something together. The husband and wife who seemed like best friends. The couple who turned their marriage into one of the most successful comedy podcasts in the world. And now, even if Your Mom's House continues, it may never feel exactly the same again. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't watching a relationship end. It's realizing that, in some ways, it had already been ending for years and millions of people were watching without knowing it.